The courtroom fell into an uneasy silence when the man in the ceremonial uniform stepped forward. White gloves, polished shoes, a face carved from discipline and restraint. Laughter rippled from the defense table. "A tomb guard?" the lawyer scoffed. "Your Honor, is this a joke?" The judge frowned. The developer smirked. The widow beside the guard trembled, clutching eviction papers with shaking hands. Then the guard spoke quietly, evenly. "I stood watch over the unknown soldier for 7 years," he said. "Today, I'm standing watch over his wife." The room stopped breathing. The bailiff called the case, his voice flat and procedural, as if this were just another line on the docket. Carter v. Langley Development Group. Evelyn Carter rose slowly from her seat. Her knees felt weak, as though the weight of the room had settled directly onto her bones. She was 68, small-framed, with silver hair pulled back neatly the way her late husband used to like it. In her hands were papers she had read 100 times and still didn't fully understand. Legal notices, lease clauses, words that felt sharp and foreign. Beside her stood James Walker. He did not look like a lawyer. He stood straight, shoulders squared, hands clasped loosely behind his back. His uniform was immaculate, dark blue, pressed to perfection, medals catching the courtroom lights. The tomb guard insignia rested over his heart, quiet and unmistakable. Whispers passed through the benches. Why is he dressed like that? Is he even allowed to speak? This isn't a military ceremony. At the defense table, Victor Langley leaned back in his chair, expensive suit draped effortlessly over confidence built on money and inevitability. His lawyer, Cole Brennan, didn't bother hiding his amusement. He adjusted his cufflinks and stood. "Your Honor," Cole began, smiling thinly, "before we waste the court's time, I'd like to clarify something. Who exactly is this man?" The judge looked over his glasses at James. "Sir?" James stepped forward one measured pace. The soles of his shoes made a soft, controlled sound against the floor. "James Walker," he said. "I'm here representing Miss Carter." A beat of silence. Then Cole laughed. Actually laughed. "Representing?" Cole repeated. "Your Honor, this gentleman appears to be, what is it, a tomb guard at Arlington? Surely the court doesn't intend to accept legal arguments from someone whose primary qualification is standing very still." A few people chuckled, not loudly, nervously. Evelyn's cheeks burned. Her fingers tightened around the papers. She leaned closer to James and whispered, "It's okay. We can leave. I don't want to cause trouble." James didn't look at her yet. His eyes stayed forward, calm, focused. Judge Harland cleared his throat. He was an older man, gray-haired, stern, with the posture of someone who valued order above sentiment. "Mr. Walker," he said slowly, "do you hold an active license to practice law in this jurisdiction?" James nodded once. "I did, and I can provide the record." Cole cut in quickly. "Did, past tense. Your Honor, with the defect, this is highly irregular. We're dealing with a straightforward lease violation. This is not the place for theatrics." James finally turned his head slightly, just enough to look at Cole. "Theatrics," he repeated softly. "No, Counselor. What's happening here is something much simpler." He reached into a worn leather folder and withdrew a single document, just one. "This notice of lease violation," James continued, holding it up, "is dated March 14th. It claims an inspection occurred at 2:17 p.m. Cole rolled his eyes, and James placed the document gently on the podium. At 2:17 p.m. on March 14th, the building management office was closed permanently, according to your own company's filing with the city. The murmur stopped. Judge Harland leaned forward. "Is that accurate, Mr. Brennan?" Cole's smile flickered, just barely. "That's not relevant." James didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "It's relevant because the inspection never happened," he said, "which means the alleged violation never occurred, which means this eviction is based on a document that cannot be true." Langley shifted in his chair for the first time. The judge held out his hand. "Bailiff, bring that document here." As the paper was passed forward, James continued, his tone steady, almost reverent. Miss Carter has lived in that apartment for 22 years. She has never missed rent. She lives alone. No pets, no subtenants, no disturbances. Cole scoffed. We'll address those claims shortly. I'm sure you will, James replied. But before we do, there's something else this court should understand. Judge Harland looked up. And what's that, Mr. Walker? James drew a breath. Not of fear, but memory. I stand watch over the tomb of the unknown soldier, he said. Every step I take is measured, every breath controlled, every movement precise. Because when you guard something sacred, mistakes aren't allowed. He paused, letting the words settle. I approach this case the same way. The judge studied him more carefully now. Evelyn felt something unfamiliar stir in her chest. Not hope exactly, but the fragile beginning of it. James turned slightly, his voice softening when he spoke to her. Miss Carter, he said, would you tell the court where you were on March 14th at 2:17 p.m.? She swallowed. I was at St. Luke's, she said, for the Veterans Grief Group. I go every Thursday. James nodded. And do you have proof? Evelyn hesitated, then reached into her purse with trembling hands. I brought the sign-in sheet. I didn't think it mattered. James accepted the paper and passed it forward. Judge Harland examined it, then looked directly at Cole. Counsel? Cole straightened, irritation creeping into his voice. Your Honor, even if there was a discrepancy in timing, the tenant still violated. James interrupted him, calmly, precisely. No, he said, she didn't. Langley slammed his palm lightly on the table. This is ridiculous. James turned fully now, meeting Langley's eyes for the first time. What's ridiculous, he said, is trying to remove a widow from her home so you can flip the property for profit. The room inhaled sharply. Judge Harland struck the gavel. Order. James lowered his gaze respectfully. My apologies, Your Honor. But the damage, or the clarity, was already done. Judge Harland sat back, his expression no longer dismissive but wary. We'll take a 10-minute recess, he said. I want to review these documents. The gavel fell. As the courtroom began to stir, Evelyn clutched James' sleeve. Her tears welled in her eyes. I didn't know, she whispered. I didn't know any of this mattered. James looked down at her. Then, his voice quiet but unwavering. It does, he said, and we're just getting started. The air at Arlington National Cemetery always felt different before dawn. It was quieter than silence, heavier than calm, the kind of stillness that pressed against the chest and demanded respect. James Walker stood at attention, heels together, shoulders squared, eyes fixed forward as the first pale light of morning crept over the rows of white headstones. Every step he took was measured, every breath controlled, every movement precise. For 7 years, this had been his post. As a tomb guard, James had learned that discipline was not just about posture or timing. It was about restraint, about carrying weight without letting it show, about honoring people whose names were lost, but whose sacrifice defined everything that came after. He had once stood in very different rooms, courtrooms filled with noise, egos, and argument, places where words were weapons, and truth was often bent into whatever power required. Back then, James Walker was one of the best, a litigator known for preparation so thorough it made opponents nervous. Judges respected him, corporations feared him, until the case that broke him. He rarely thought about it now, at least not directly, but some mornings, as the flag was raised and the wind tugged gently at the fabric, the memory crept in anyway. A veteran, wrongfully evicted, a settlement forced behind closed doors, a man who died 6 months later, never seeing justice done. James had walked away from the law not because he stopped believing in it, but because he realized how easily it could be hollowed out. Standing guard here was simpler, cleaner, honest. It was on a Tuesday afternoon after the changing of the guard ceremony that he noticed Evelyn Carter. She stood several rows back, holding a small folded flag against her chest. She didn't cry loudly, didn't draw attention. Her shoulders were tense, her face set in the quiet grief of someone who had learned not to ask for much. James noticed everything. It was part of the job. When the crowd dispersed, she lingered. Finally, she approached, hesitant, as though afraid of breaking an unspoken rule. "Excuse me," she said softly. I just wanted to say thank you." James nodded once. "Ma'am?" My husband, she continued, her voice trembling, he served Vietnam, infantry. She glanced at the tomb. He always said places like this mattered, that someone standing watch meant he hadn't been forgotten. James said nothing. He didn't need to. Evelyn hesitated. Then her composure cracked. She pressed the folded flag tighter, her knuckles whitening. "They're taking my apartment," she said suddenly. "They say I broke the lease, but I didn't. I swear I didn't." James felt it then, the familiar tightening in his chest. "Who's they, ma'am?" he asked. "The landlord, a developer. They're buying everything around us. I've lived there 22 years. Her voice dropped to a whisper. "They say I have too many people staying with me, but it's just me. It's always been just me." She fumbled in her purse and pulled out the eviction notice. The paper shook in her hands. James glanced at it. Just a glance was enough to— "Why would you help me?" James didn't answer right away. He thought of the man from years ago, of a widow standing alone against a system that counted on her giving up. "Because your husband served," he said finally, "and because this isn't right." Over the next week, James reviewed everything: rent receipts, maintenance requests, emails. He noticed patterns: tenants pushed out one by one, repairs delayed until people left, new permits filed almost immediately after vacancies. Langley Development Group wasn't just managing property, they were clearing it. James drafted a response letter, clear, concise, unflinching. He cited tenant protection statutes, anti-retaliation laws, precedent cases involving false inspections. Langley's response came 2 days later, a threat: vacate immediately or face additional legal action. Evelyn called James in tears. "I don't think I can do this," she said. "They're too big. I'm just me." James listened. Then he said quietly, "Miss Carter, have you ever seen the changing of the guard?" "Yes," she sniffed. "My husband insisted." "Did you notice how the guard never breaks posture?" James asked. "Yeah." "That's not because he's unfeeling," James said. "It's because some things don't bend under pressure." He paused. "Neither do we." The court date was set for the following month. James pressed his uniform the night before, not because it was required, but because it reminded him who he was now and why he was doing this. As he stood by the window, city lights flickering in the distance, he thought of the courtroom ahead, the laughter, the doubt, the resistance. He welcomed it, because this time he wasn't walking away. James approached Evelyn Carter's case the same way he approached his watch at Arlington, slowly, deliberately, and without assumptions. Every evening after his shift, he sat at the small wooden table in his apartment, the eviction files spread out before him like a battlefield's map. No television, no music, just the quiet scratch of a pen and the steady rhythm of someone who understood that details decided outcomes. At first glance, Langley Development Group's paperwork looked polished, professional, confident. The kind of documents designed to overwhelm an ordinary tenant into surrender. But James wasn't ordinary. He started with the timeline. The alleged lease violation was dated March 14th. The inspection report claimed multiple unauthorized occupants observed over a 2-week period. That alone raised a red flag. Housing law required specificity: dates, times, names. Vague accusations were legally fragile. James circled the language with a red pen. Observed multiple individuals entering and exiting unit. Observed by whom? He flipped to the signature page. The inspection report was signed by a property compliance officer. No printed name, just a looping signature that looked more decorative than functional. James leaned back in his chair, eyes narrowing. He opened his laptop and pulled public records. Langley Development Group had filed for renovation permits on the building less than 3 weeks after issuing Evelyn's notice. Electrical upgrades, plumbing modernization, luxury conversion. James let out a slow breath. This wasn't about a lease violation. It never had been. It was about clearing the building. He pulled Evelyn's rent history. 22 years, not a single late payment, no complaints, no warnings, no prior violations. She was exactly the kind of tenant developers disliked: stable, protected, impossible to price out without force. James picked up the phone and called her. "They're lying," he said gently. There was a pause on the other end. "I know," Evelyn whispered, "but how do we prove it?" "We approve motive," James replied, "and we prove pattern." Over the next few days, James dug deeper. He found 3 other tenants in the same building who had received nearly identical notices within a 6-month window, all over 60, all living alone, all paying below market rent. 2 had already left. 1 had tried to fight and lost. James visited the building himself, standing across the street in civilian clothes, observing. The property manager avoided eye contact when James asked simple questions. Maintenance logs were incomplete. Security cameras were installed, but oddly angled. He requested copies of the inspection footage through a formal letter. Langley's legal team responded with silence. Instead, Evelyn received something else, a second notice. This one claimed new violations: noise complaints, smoke odor, unauthorized animals. Evelyn was devastated. "I don't smoke," she said, her voice cracking. "I don't even own a cat." James examined the attached photos. Blurry, poorly lit, taken from the hallway, not inside the apartment. "These don't prove anything," James said. "They prove desperation." The night before the hearing, James organized his materials with military precision. He stacked documents in the order he would present them. He highlighted statutes, marked precedent cases. One case in particular stood out: a state appellate ruling that established a clear standard. When a landlord initiates eviction shortly before or after filing redevelopment permits, the burden shifts to the landlord to prove the eviction is not retaliatory. James smiled faintly. That case had been his, years ago, another life. As he slipped the folder into his bag, his phone buzzed, an unknown number. He hesitated, then answered. "Mr. Walker," a smooth voice said, "this is Cole Brennan." James felt no surprise. "Yes." "I'll be blunt," Cole continued. "You're embarrassing your client. This is a losing fight." James said nothing. "Langley is prepared to be generous," Cole went on. "A relocation stipend, enough for a small place outside the city, if Miss Carter agrees to leave quietly." James closed his eyes for a moment. "She's not for sale," he said. Cole sighed. "You were a good lawyer once. You know how this ends." James's voice hardened. "I know exactly how it ends." The line went dead. The morning of the hearing, Evelyn could barely eat. She sat on a bench outside the courthouse, clutching her purse as though it might float away. "They're going to crush me," she whispered. James stood beside her, uniform pressed, shoes gleaming. "They're counting on that," he said. "Don't give it to them." Inside the courtroom buzzed with low conversation. Langley sat confidently, whispering to Cole when he noticed James, his lips curled into a smirk. James ignored him. As the judge entered, James felt the familiar shift, the moment when everything else fell away. Strategy, timing, control. Cole opened aggressively, presenting the second notice as additional evidence. He called the property manager as a witness, who testified vaguely about ongoing concerns. James listened, expression neutral, taking notes. When it was his turn, he rose slowly. "Mr. Alvarez," James said, addressing the witness, "you testified that you personally observed these violations. Is that correct?" "Yes," the man replied. James nodded. "On March 14th? "Yes." "At 2:17 p.m.? The witness hesitated. "Around that time." James held up a document. "This is your work schedule. According to your employer, you clocked out at noon that day." The witness blinked. Maybe I'm mistaken." James turned to the judge. "Your Honor, may I approach?" He placed the document gently on the bench. "And this," James continued, "is the city permit Langley Development filed 3 weeks after issuing Evelyn's notice." The courtroom murmured. Langley's smirk faded. James looked directly at him now. "This isn't enforcement," James said evenly. "It's displacement." Cole jumped to his feet. "Objection." "Sustained," the judge said, but his tone had changed. James sat down. As the judge called for a short recess, a court officer approached James. "Sir," he said quietly, "there's an issue." James stood. "What kind of issue?" The officer lowered his voice. "The defense has filed a complaint alleging you submitted falsified documents." Evelyn gasped. James felt the familiar tightening in his chest. He met the officer's gaze, calm and unflinching. Then he said, "We should address it properly." Across the room, Langley watched him with a satisfied expression. James knew that look. It was the look of someone who believed the system would protect him, and it told James exactly how far this fight was going to go. The hallway outside the courtroom smelled faintly of old paper and disinfectant. Evelyn sat on a wooden bench, her hands folded so tightly in her lap that her knuckles had gone pale. Across from her, James stood at ease, his posture straight but not rigid, eyes fixed on nothing in particular. The accusation hung in the air like smoke. "Falsified documents," Evelyn whispered, barely able to say the words. "James, what if they believe him?" James finally turned to her. His expression was calm, but she could see something steady and unmovable beneath it. "Truth doesn't panic," James said. "Lies do." Before she could respond, the bailiff called them back inside. The courtroom felt different now. What had started as casual curiosity had sharpened into attention. People leaned forward in their seats. Even the judge, Judge Harland, sat a little straighter, his hands no longer resting comfortably on the bench. Cole Brennan opened aggressively, presenting the second notice as additional evidence. He called the property manager as a witness, who testified vaguely about ongoing concerns. James listened, expression